nowhere you need to be, nothing you need to finish, nothing you need to figure out. All I'd like to do is read to you, slowly, quietly, one page at a time. You don't have to listen carefully. You don't have to remember every detail. If your thoughts drift away, let them. If you lose your place, that's perfectly all right. Stories are patient. They know how to wait. And if sleep finds you before we reach the final page, I hope it arrives gently, like an old friend who already knows the way. For now, you can simply be here. This evening can simply be yours. Whenever you're ready, I'll turn the first page. By the time Daniel returned to the village, almost nothing had changed. The road still wound its way down the hillside, just as it had when he was a boy. The walnut trees still leaned over the path, their branches bending a little lower than he remembered. Some of the houses had fresh white walls. Some had lost their shutters. One chimney had disappeared altogether. But the village itself felt as though it had simply taken a long, quiet breath and decided to wait for him. Daniel stopped at the top of the hill. The morning air carried the smell of damp earth, fresh bread, and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announced a day that had already begun. A shepherd answered with a whistle. Then everything became quiet again. He smiled, not because anything remarkable had happened, but because he had forgotten that a village could be quiet in so many different ways. City silence was never truly silent. There were engines, footsteps, voices beyond closed windows. Even in the middle of the night, a city always seemed to be expecting something. This silence was different. It asked for nothing. It simply existed. Daniel adjusted the leather strap resting across his shoulder and began walking. His boots knew the road before he did. There was the old bakery, its wooden sign hanging slightly crooked, the narrow well where children once lowered empty buckets just to hear the echo, the low stone wall where he and his friends had spent long summer evenings trying to guess whose sheep would return first. He remembered things he hadn't expected to remember. The rough bark of the walnut tree beside the mill, the sound of rain striking the roof of his childhood home, his mother's habit of leaving the kitchen window open even in winter because she liked hearing the first birds before sunrise. He hadn't thought about that for years. Memory, he decided, was a curious traveler. It never arrived when invited. It simply appeared whenever it pleased. Daniel smiled to himself. The village, it seemed, had been waiting patiently for his memories long before it had been waiting for him. He walked a little farther. The road began to narrow. The walnut trees stood closer together here, casting cool shadows across the ground. A breeze carried a few dry leaves, slowly, almost lazily, across the path. Then he stopped. There it was, the stone, exactly where it had always been. The stone seemed smaller now that he was standing beside it. Daniel rested one hand against its weathered surface. It felt cool beneath his fingertips, smoother than he had expected. Years of rain had shaped it. Years of wind had softened its edges. And somewhere, over countless mornings and quiet afternoons, thousands of passing hands had polished the side facing the road. He stepped back. The bend really was too narrow. 2 carts could pass, but only if one of them waited. His eyes followed the curve of the road. Almost immediately, he heard it. The gentle rattle of wooden wheels. An old cart appeared between the walnut trees, slowly, not because it was tired, simply because there was no reason to hurry. Before the cart reached the stone, another cart appeared from the opposite direction. Daniel instinctively watched the road. One driver smiled. The other lifted a hand in greeting. Without a single word, the first horse came to a quiet stop. The second cart rolled gently past. The two men tipped their hats. "Good morning. And to you. How is your wife?" "Much stronger now. Thank you." A small smile, a quiet nod, then another question. "And your grandson?" "He started helping at the mill this week. I suppose he'll be taller than both of us before winter." "I expect he will." For another moment, neither man reached for the reins. The silence between them felt comfortable, like something neither of them wished to interrupt. Eventually, one horse stepped forward, then the other. Within a few moments, the road belonged to the wind again. Daniel remained where he was. He hadn't been listening to the conversation. Not really. His eyes had been measuring the width of the bend, the distance between the wheels, the slope beside the ditch. Without realizing it, his thoughts had already begun solving the problem. A straighter road, a wider turn, better drainage, safer passage. He had solved far more difficult problems than this. The answer seemed almost embarrassingly simple. A little later, an elderly shepherd appeared with a small flock of sheep. As he reached the stone, he rested his hand upon it, only for a moment, not to steady himself, not because he was tired. It was such a small gesture that Daniel almost missed it. The shepherd continued down the hill, never looking back. Daniel watched him disappear among the trees. Then he looked once more at the stone. It was only a stone, nothing more. And yet, everyone who came this way seemed to arrive a little slower and leave a little later. Daniel brushed the dust from his hands. Tomorrow, he decided, he would return with tools. The following morning, Daniel returned before the village had fully awakened. A thin layer of mist still rested over the fields. The air carried the coolness of the night, though the first warmth of morning had already begun to touch the hills. This time, he wasn't carrying only memories. A coil of rope rested across his shoulder. An iron bar hung loosely from one hand. In the other, a small notebook. He stopped beside the stone. For a while, he said nothing. He simply looked at it. Then, almost out of habit, he measured the width of the road once more, the angle of the bend. He checked his notes, then measured everything again, not because he doubted himself, because good work deserved certainty. Behind him, someone spoke. "You're here early." Daniel turned. The old woman was arranging apples outside her small wooden stall. She smiled without looking surprised. "So are you," he replied. "I've always been," she said softly. Daniel smiled. He looked back at the road. "I've been thinking about this stone. I know. It doesn't have to stay here." The old woman placed another apple into the basket. "No." Daniel shook his head. "The road is too narrow." She waited. "When two carts meet, one of them has to stop." She nodded. "Yes. It doesn't need to be that way." Again, she simply nodded. For a few quiet moments, only birds could be heard between them. Finally, she asked. "Difficult," she said gently. "For whom?" Daniel looked at her. "For everyone." She lowered her eyes to the apples once more. "Perhaps." After a quiet moment, she added, "Perhaps not." Daniel waited for her to say something else. She didn't. The silence lingered, just long enough to make him wonder whether the conversation had already ended. He looked once more at the stone, then toward the village. By now, a few people had begun opening their shutters. Someone swept the front step of a small house. Smoke rose slowly from another chimney. The village was waking gently. Daniel took a slow breath. Then he said, "I'll come back tomorrow." He rested one hand upon the stone, almost unconsciously. just as so many others had done before him. I'll bring help. For the first time, the old woman looked directly into his eyes. She smiled, not with agreement, not with disagreement, simply with kindness. Daniel lifted the rope onto his shoulder, turned toward the village, and walked away. Behind him, the stone remained exactly where it had always been, waiting for one last sunrise. Morning arrived quietly. The mist had already begun to lift, leaving tiny drops of water on the grass beside the road. Daniel returned, just as he had promised. The rope rested across his shoulder. The iron bar got the morning light. 3 men were already waiting. None of them asked many questions. They simply greeted Daniel, looked at the stone, and understood why they were there. The old woman was arranging apples once again. She looked toward the road, then back to her basket. Without a word, she continued working. Daniel placed the rope carefully on the ground. He walked once around the stone, one last time, not because he had changed his mind, only because he wanted to be certain. He nodded. This should do. The others stepped forward. The rope was wrapped around the stone. The iron bar slid beneath one edge. One man adjusted his footing. Another tightened the rope. Nobody hurried. There was no reason to. Daniel looked at each of them. When you're ready, they pulled together. At first, nothing happened. The stone remained exactly where it had always been. The rope grew tight. The wood creaked. The men leaned a little farther. A faint sound, almost too quiet to notice, came from beneath the stone. The earth was letting go, slowly, very slowly. The stone moved, only the width of a hand, then a little more. Small pieces of soil crumbled away. Another careful pull, another quiet shift, and then, for the first time in longer than anyone could remember, the stone gave way. Patiently, they worked it toward the side of the road. Not far, only far enough. When the ropes finally fell loose, the bend was wider. The road, at last, could breathe. No one cheered. No one applauded. The work had simply been finished. Daniel wiped the dust from his hands. The road looked different now. The bend was wider. The path felt open. A few minutes later, the familiar sound of wooden wheels echoed through the trees. A cart appeared, then another. This time, neither slowed down. The horses passed one another with ease. No waiting, no hesitation, just a smooth, unbroken journey. Daniel watched until they disappeared beyond the hill. A quiet smile crossed his face. The road looked exactly as he had imagined. Wider, safer, easier. The days passed quietly. Life, as it often does, continued without asking anyone's permission. The road was easier now. Wagons no longer slowed at the bend. Two carts could pass one another without stopping, without waiting, without thinking about it at all. Daniel noticed it. Each time he walked the road, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The work had been worth doing. At least, that was what he believed. One afternoon, he stopped outside the bakery. As he stepped back onto the road, two wagons approached from opposite directions. They passed one another effortlessly. The wheels never paused. The horses never slowed. Within a few seconds, both wagons had disappeared beyond the trees. Daniel smiled. Exactly as planned. He continued walking. A little farther down the hill, he heard another pair of wheels. Again, two wagons met. Again, they passed without hesitation. No waiting, no greeting, no laughter, only the quiet rhythm of wheels upon stone. Daniel kept walking. He didn't think anything of it. Why would he? The road was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. Another week passed. The mornings grew a little cooler. The evenings arrived a little sooner. One morning, Daniel found himself slowing as he reached the old bend. Not because he needed to, simply out of habit. He stopped, almost without realizing it, looked toward the road, then reason to stop anymore, so he walked on. Behind him, 2 wagons crossed paths. Neither one slowed. Neither driver looked toward the other. The sound of their wheels faded quickly into the valley. The road had become wonderfully efficient. It carried everyone forward, smoothly, quietly, without asking anyone to wait. Another week passed. The village carried on, just as villages always do. The harvest came. Children ran through the narrow streets. The bakery filled the morning air with the smell of fresh bread. Nothing seemed out of place. And yet, something had become strangely quiet. Daniel couldn't have said exactly when he first noticed it, only that one morning he found himself standing where the stone had once been. He looked down the road, then toward the place where the stone now rested. The road was open, smooth, easy, just as he had planned. Behind him, he heard the familiar sound of wooden crates. The old woman was arranging her apples. Daniel walked over. For a while, neither of them spoke. They simply watched the road together. After a long silence, Daniel finally said, "You knew." The old woman smiled. "I've watched this road for longer than I can remember." She picked up another apple, turned it slowly in her hands, then placed it into the basket. Daniel kept looking toward the road. "I made it better." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded gently. "You made it easier." Another silence settled between them. Neither hurried to fill it. Finally, she spoke again. "Sometimes," she said softly, "those are not the same thing." Daniel didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes remained on the empty bend. He remembered 2 carts waiting, 2 strangers becoming neighbors for half a minute, a question about someone's wife, a laugh, a hat lifted in greeting. Small moments, so ordinary that no one had ever thought to protect them. The evening light stretched gently across the road. A soft breeze stirred the walnut leaves. Daniel stood there, listening to a silence he had never noticed before. For the first time, the road had forgotten how to pause. tonight.